in a world where the law can be bought and truth can be buried. Who decides what is right? A former marshal who walked away from the badge, or the powerful men who twisted it? When a young girl becomes the target of greed, one choice will determine everything. Walk away, or stand and fight. If this story made you think, leave a like, share your perspective in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter.
The wind off the Wyoming plains carried the bite of early winter. Elias Cole sat loose in the saddle. He let the old brown gelding Rudy find his own pace along the northern fence line. It was quiet. He liked it quiet. 7 years of quiet was the only thing keeping the ghosts in his head asleep. Then the wind shifted. Dogs, not coyotes, hunting hounds. Elias tightened his grip on the reins. Rudy's ears flicked back. Hoofbeats drummed against the frozen earth. They were coming from the tree line just past the western gate. He rode toward the sound. Through the morning mist, he saw it. A bundle of rags at the base of the gate. No. A child. She was yanking at the rusted iron latch, pulling, tearing the skin right off her frozen knuckles. Her boots were worn through the toes. The heavy canvas coat she wore swallowed her whole. Men were shouting in the brush. 3 riders breaking through the pines. The girl looked back. Her chest heaved. The strength left her legs all at once. 3 days of running crashed down on her narrow shoulders. She collapsed into the cold mud. She pulled the oversized coat tight against her chest. She buried her face in the dirt and let out a scream that tore the morning wide open. Nobody will come. They said nobody would come. Elias felt something cold and hard snap back into place inside his chest. A reflex buried 7 years deep. He nudged Rudy. The massive horse stepped forward. He blocked the sunlight, casting a long shadow right over the trembling girl. Rudy stopped dead at the gate. He didn't shift. He didn't spook. Elias stepped down from the saddle. He didn't hurry. He walked to the wooden fence and rested his right hand on the worn walnut grip of his colt. He didn't draw the weapon. He just stood there. The riders pulled up hard at the edge of the clearing. Their horses danced, kicking up dirt. The lead rider squinted through the morning glare. He saw the quiet man by the gate. He saw the way the man stood. He knew who he was looking at. Former Marshal Cole. The men didn't speak. They turned their horses and rode hard back into the timber. Silence rushed back in. Just the sound of the wind and the ragged breathing of the child in the mud. Elias unhooked his canteen. He knelt down, slowly so he wouldn't spook her. She rolled over. Her eyes were gray, like the sky before a twister. She wasn't crying. She was just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. He held out the water. Her raw, bleeding hand shook as she took it. She didn't drink. She looked at Rudy. Then she poured a little water into her palm and held it out for the horse. The animal took it. Only then did she drink. She wiped her cracked lips with a dirty sleeve. She stared at the tall man. "Your horse stopped," she said. Her voice was raspy, dry as cracked leather. "He did," Elias said. "Why did you stop?" she asked. She didn't sound grateful. She sounded suspicious. "You don't know me. They were going to hurt me." Elias looked at the bruised, starving 9-year-old girl. He didn't offer a half-truth. He didn't shrug it off. He looked her dead in the eye, and he told her exactly how the world was supposed to work. Because no human being, especially a child, deserves to be hunted like an animal, Elias said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of an absolute vow. Your life has value, same as anyone else's. Human dignity doesn't allow me to turn my back when you cry. You have a fundamental right to be safe and free. And no one, no matter how much power or money they have, has the right to strip that away from you. The girl stared at him. The guarded gray in her eyes shifted. Just a fraction. "My name is Clara," she whispered. "Elias," he said. He stood up and offered his hand. "Let's get you inside, Clara." The farmhouse was quiet. Not a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a place that had forgotten how to live. Elias stood by the cast-iron stove. The smell of burning pine and salted bacon filled the small room. He cracked 2 eggs into the cast-iron skillet. The grease popped. It was the only sound in the house. Clara sat at the oak table. She didn't fidget. She didn't swing her legs. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She was swallowed up by one of Elias's old flannel shirts. He had rolled the sleeves up past her elbows. He slid the eggs and bacon onto a tin plate. He set it down in front of her. He put a fork beside it. "Eat," he said. She picked up the fork. She didn't attack the food. She took a small bite, chewed it thoroughly, swallowed, took another. She ate like a survivor who knew that eating too fast on a starved stomach would only bring it right back up. Elias poured himself a cup of black coffee. He leaned against the counter. He watched her. She noticed everything. Her gray eyes swept the room between bites. She saw the bare walls, no pictures, no curtains, no flowers in a jar. Just a rifle mounted above the door and a row of winter coats on wooden pegs. Then she looked at the corner of the room. There was a narrow door there. It led to a storage room. It was secured with a heavy brass padlock. The brass was dull. The hinges were dusty. Elias saw her looking at it. He waited for the question. Most kids would ask, "What's in there? Why is it locked?" Clara just looked back down at her eggs. She didn't ask. She already knew a universal truth about the world. Closed doors were closed for a reason. Elias took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter. He liked it that way. The sound of wagon wheels cut through the morning air. Rudy nickered from the barn. A heavy pair of draft horses pulled a buckboard into the yard. Elias sighed. He set his cup down. He knew that wagon. Everyone in a 10-mile radius knew that wagon. Agnes Tully didn't wait for an invitation. She never did. The front door swung open. Agnes filled the frame. She was 61 years old, built like a sturdy brick oven, and carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She had a tongue like a sharpening stone and a heart that she tried very hard to hide. "Elias Cole, if you don't fix that rut out by the main road, I'm going to charge you for a broken axle," she announced. Then she stopped. She saw the girl. Agnes froze. The basket in her hands dipped. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back, fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Agnes looked at Elias. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "Agnes, this is Clara." Agnes set the basket on the table. She didn't ask Elias where the child came from. She didn't ask what happened. She just walked right up to Clara. She looked at the bruised cheek, the tangled hair, the too big shirt. Agnes reached out. Her hand was rough from farm work, but her touch was light. She brushed a strand of dirty hair out of Clara's eyes. "Well," Agnes said softly. Her voice lost all its edge. "You look like you've been dragged backward through a briar patch, little bird." Clara didn't flinch. "I fell," she said simply. "I reckon you did," Agnes said. She turned on Elias. The edge came right back. "She needs a bath. She needs clothes that don't smell like a wet dog. Put water on the stove to boil. Now." Elias didn't argue. You didn't argue with Agnes Tully. For the next hour, the farmhouse was chaotic. Elias chopped wood. He hauled buckets from the pump. Agnes took over the small washroom. He could hear her talking to the girl, not baby talk. Agnes spoke to her like a person. He couldn't hear Clara's replies. They were too quiet. When they emerged, Clara looked different. Agnes had scrubbed the dirt away. She had dressed the girl in a plain cotton dress she must have had in the wagon, probably meant for the preacher's daughter in town. Clara's wet hair was combed flat. She looked smaller now, fragile. Clara sat by the stove to dry. Within 10 minutes, her head nodded. The warmth, the full stomach, the clean skin, the sheer exhaustion took her under. She curled up on the rug and fell into a dead sleep. Agnes walked out to the front porch. Elias followed. He offered her a cup of coffee. She took it. They stood side by side, looking out over the rolling Wyoming plains. The wind was picking up again. Joseph Holt's girl, Agnes said. It wasn't a question. Elias looked at her sharply. How did you know? I've lived here 20 years, Elias. I know every face. She's got his eyes. And I know Joseph died 3 weeks ago. Folks in town are calling it a riding accident. Agnes took a sip of coffee. Half the town knows it's a lie. The other half is trying real hard not to look. Elias stared out at the fence line. She showed up at my gate this morning. Men were chasing her. Briggs's men, most likely. Elias gripped the porch rail. The wood was cold. I can't keep her, Agnes. I'm going to let her rest. Feed her up. Then I'm taking her to the authorities in Cheyenne, or maybe find her an aunt. Agnes turned her head. She looked at him, hard. I can't, Elias repeated, his voice low. You know I can't. Look at this place. Look at me. I don't know how to keep anything alive anymore. I bring trouble. The ghosts are too loud here. I'm just going to send her away where she's safe. Agnes didn't soften. She didn't pat his arm. She set her coffee cup on the rail with a sharp clack. You listen to me, Elias Cole, Agnes said. Her voice rang out, clear and uncompromising. Compassion between people isn't a choice you only make when it's convenient. It's a duty. Elias looked down. Agnes stepped closer. She wouldn't let him look away. When you refuse to shelter a child running from evil, you aren't staying out of the fight. You are choosing the side of evil. You think turning her away keeps your hands clean? It doesn't. Equality starts when you treat this child's life as having the exact same value as your false peace. She ran to you. She didn't run to the sheriff. She ran to the man her daddy trusted. Her daddy is dead, Elias said bitterly. And she's breathing, Agnes fired back. She's breathing in your house. You turn her out, you might as well sign her death warrant yourself. Agnes picked up her cup. She turned toward the steps. I'll be back tomorrow, she said over her shoulder. I'll bring some proper boots. She's a size 3, near as I can figure. Elias watched her wagon roll away. The dust settled on the road. He stood on the porch for a long time. The sun sank low. The shadows stretched long across the dirt. He went back inside. The fire had died down to glowing coals. Clara was still asleep on the rug. She was curled tight into a ball like a cornered animal trying to make itself small. Even in her sleep, her brow was furrowed. Elias walked quietly to the corner of the room. He stood in front of the locked door. The brass padlock caught the dim light of the coals. Behind that door were books, a woman's dresses, a boy's wooden carved horse, things he hadn't looked at in 7 years, things that smelled like smoke in his nightmares. He didn't touch the lock. He turned away. He picked up an old wool blanket from the back of a chair. He walked over and laid it gently over Clara's shoulders. She stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him in the dim light. Are you going to send me back? She whispered. Elias crouched down. He looked at the locked door. Then he looked back at the little girl. Go to sleep, Clara, he said. Nobody is taking you anywhere tonight. 2 days passed. The rhythm of the farm was slow, predictable. Elias thought Clara would chafe against it. Most kids needed to run, needed to play. Clara didn't play. She shadowed him. It was morning. The air was crisp, the sky a bruised, brilliant blue. Elias was in the corral. He was showing Clara how to hold her hand flat when offering an apple to Rudy. Keep your fingers together, Elias said. Like a board. He's got big teeth. He doesn't want to bite you, but a carrot looks a lot like a finger if he's not paying attention. Clara held her hand out. She was completely still. Rudy lowered his massive head. He snuffled her palm. His soft lips picked up the apple. He crunched it loudly. A tiny ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips. It was gone in a second, but Elias saw it. Then Rudy's ears pinned back. He stopped chewing. He looked toward the road. Elias felt it before he heard it, the vibration in the ground. He turned. 3 riders were coming up the long drive. They weren't rushing. They were riding at a deliberate, arrogant trot. Clara, Elias said. His voice dropped an octave. It was the voice of a man who used to command the streets of Dodge City. Go into the barn, go to the loft, pull the ladder up, do not come down until I say your name. Clara didn't ask questions. She dropped the rest of her apple. She sprinted for the barn, her new boots kicking up dust. Elias stepped out of the corral. He closed the gate behind him. He walked to the center of the yard and waited. The riders pulled up. 2 of them were hired muscle, hard-eyed men with trail dust on their coats and tied-down holsters. They kept their hands resting casually on their thighs, inches from the iron. The man in the middle was different. Nate Driscoll wore a suit. It was a fine wool suit, the kind you saw in Denver or Chicago, out of place in the Wyoming dirt. He had a bowler hat. He wore a smile that looked like it had been painted on by a cheap artist. "Mr. Cole," Driscoll said. He tipped his hat. "A pleasure. Truly. I've heard the stories." Elias didn't smile back. He didn't offer a greeting. "You're on my property." Driscoll chuckled. He swung down from his horse. He dusted off his sleeves. The 2 hired men stayed in the saddle, looking down, assessing angles. "I apologize for the intrusion," Driscoll said smoothly. He reached inside his breast pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. "But I represent the Silver Creek Bank, and by extension, Mr. Harlan Briggs. We've been looking for a little lost sheep." "No sheep here," Elias said. "Come now, Mr. Cole," Driscoll smiled. "We know she's here. Clara Holt, tragic business about her father, terrible accident. The bank, as the primary holder of Mr. Holt's outstanding debts, has taken a vested interest in the child's welfare." Driscoll stepped forward. He held out the paper. Elias didn't move his hands. "I know Joseph Holt. He didn't have debts." "Paperwork says otherwise," Driscoll sighed, feigning sadness. "And since the girl has no immediate kin in the territory, the court has appointed Mr. Briggs as her temporary guardian. For her own protection, of course." Elias looked at the paper. It had a wax seal. It had a judge's signature. Judge Cleary. A man everyone knew Briggs owned lock, stock, and barrel. It was perfect. It was legal. It was a death sentence. "I'm afraid I have to insist," Driscoll said. His smile vanished. The polite facade cracked, revealing the cold iron beneath. "Bring the girl out, Mr. Cole, or I will have the sheriff out here by sundown to arrest you for kidnapping." Elias finally moved. He took the paper from Driscoll's hand. He read it. He took his time. He let the silence stretch out. He let the hired men get nervous. He let Driscoll wait. Then Elias crumpled the parchment in his fist. He tossed it into the dirt at Driscoll's polished shoes. Driscoll blinked. "Now, see here." Elias stepped forward. Just 1 step. But it was enough to make the 2 hired horses dance nervously backward. The air in the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You call this the law, Driscoll?" Elias's voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, steady rumble, like distant thunder. He looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. The law was forged to protect people, not to legalize greed. Driscoll opened his mouth. Elias cut him off. "This child's right to live freely and safely is a fundamental right granted by the Creator," Elias stated, his words hitting like hammer strikes on an anvil. "It stands higher than any forged piece of paper. It stands higher than Briggs, higher than your bought judge." Elias pointed a finger at the crumpled paper in the dirt. "Don't you dare bring a rich man's paper to dictate a vulnerable child's fate on my property. You want her? You bring the federal marshal from Laramie. You bring God himself. But if you or these 2 stray dogs step foot on my grass again, I won't ask for paperwork." Driscoll stared at the tall man. He looked at Elias's hands. He saw the way Elias stood. Relaxed, balanced, ready. Driscoll swallowed hard. He bent down, picked up the crumpled paper, and shoved it back into his pocket. He climbed back onto his horse. "You're a fool, Cole," Driscoll sneered, pulling on the reins. "You're a relic. The West is changing. Law is made by men who build things now. You have 48 hours. Then I come back with the sheriff and a warrant for your arrest." They turned their horses. They rode out. faster than they came. Elias watched them until they were nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. He stood there for a long time. His heart was hammering against his ribs. The old fire was back in his blood. He didn't like it. It felt too familiar. It felt like Dodge City. It felt like the day everything burned. He turned and walked toward the barn. "Clara," he called out softly. He walked into the cool shade of the barn. The air smelled of hay and leather. He looked up at the loft. The ladder was pulled up. "Clara, they're gone." There was a rustle of straw. The heavy wooden ladder slid down, hitting the dirt floor with a thud. Clara climbed down. She was holding something tight against her chest. It was the heavy canvas coat she had been wearing when she arrived, the one that was 3 sizes too big, the one that belonged to a grown man. She stood in the dirt, clutching the coat. Her knuckles were white. Her face was pale. She had heard everything. Elias knelt down in the dirt. He leveled his eyes with hers. "He's coming back," Clara whispered. "Not today," Elias said. "They won't stop." Clara's voice shook just a little. "Mr. Briggs wants what Papa had." Elias frowned. He looked at the coat. Really looked at it. It was heavy, thicker than it needed to be. "Clara," Elias said slowly, "what did your father give you?" Clara looked down at the coat. She ran her fingers over the thick lining on the inside panel. The stitching was clumsy, rushed, done with thick twine. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a breath. "Papa just said, he said, don't let anyone take the coat, even if you're freezing. He sewed it in the night before he died." Elias stared at the thick seam. Suddenly, everything made sense. The hounds, the armed men, the bought judge. They weren't chasing a little girl to save her from being an orphan. They weren't chasing her to collect a debt. They were chasing the coat. Joseph Holt hadn't just run. He had found something Briggs couldn't afford to let see the light of day. And he had hidden it on the only thing Briggs wouldn't think to burn right away, his fleeing daughter. Elias stood up. He looked out the barn doors toward the empty road. He had 48 hours. "Come on," Elias said. He reached out and gently put his hand on her shoulder. "Let's go inside. I need a knife. We're going to open that coat." Clara didn't hesitate. She nodded once. She walked beside him, clutching the secret her father died for, stepping into the long shadow Elias cast across the yard. The ground was damp, soft enough to hold a story. Elias knelt in the dirt near the northern fence line. The morning sun burned the last of the frost off the prairie grass. He pointed a calloused finger at an indention in the mud. "Look here," Elias said. Clara crouched beside him. She wrapped her oversized coat tight around her narrow shoulders. She didn't complain about the cold. She just watched his hand. "See the shape?" Elias asked. "Rounded at the front, deep in the toe. That's a horseshoe, but look at the edge. It's not smooth. It's chipped." Clara leaned closer. Her gray eyes narrowed. "Who does it belong to?" "Belongs to the gray mare the man named Akers was riding yesterday. The hired gun," Elias said. He traced the edge of the print with a dry twig. "He favors her left side. She's carrying more weight there. Means the rider leans heavy in the saddle. Careless." "Why are you showing me this?" Clara asked. "Because a man's tracks tell you who he is before he ever opens his mouth," Elias said. He stood up. He brushed the dirt from his denim knees. "And out here, knowing who is coming before they arrive is what keeps you breathing." They walked along the fence. The wire was loose in places. The winter storms had pulled the staples out of the cedar posts. Elias carried a heavy canvas bag of tools. Clara carried the small canvas pouch of heavy iron staples. They worked in a rhythm. Elias would pull the wire taut with the claw of his hammer. He would hold his hand out. Clara would place a staple squarely in his palm, not tossing it, not fumbling, putting it right where he needed it. Whack, whack. The hammer drove the iron into the wood. The wire sang like a plucked guitar string. They did this for an hour. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was just the quiet of two people working. "Mr. Cole," Clara said eventually. Elias kept his eyes on the wire. "Just Elias is fine." "Elias," she tested the name. It sounded big in her small mouth. "Did you have children?" The hammer stopped in midair. The wind blew across the open pasture. It rustled the dead grass. Elias didn't look at her. He looked at the rusted wire. 7 years of practice told him to shut down, to change the subject, to walk away. But he looked down at the girl. He saw the empty pouch in her hands. He saw the bruises fading on her cheek. He lowered the hammer. "I had a boy," Elias said. His voice was thick, like he was swallowing sand. "His name was Thomas." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't say she was sorry. She knew better than most that sorry didn't fix a damn thing. "What did Thomas like?" she asked softly. Elias closed his eyes for a second. The memory didn't come with fire this time. It came with the sound of rain on a tin roof. "He liked the rain," Elias said. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, just a fraction. "Loved it. Used to sit in the open barn door when the sky poured. He would carve these little wooden horses. They were terrible, looked like lumpy dogs. But he loved them." Clara looked out over the pasture. "Papa made me a doll once, out of corn husks. It was ugly, too. But it was mine." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. They were a pair, the two of them, standing in the middle of nowhere, holding onto the ugly, beautiful things the dead left behind. "Elias," Clara asked, looking up, "why did you stop being a marshal?" Elias leaned his hammer against the cedar post. He took his hat off. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. He looked out toward the town of Silver Creek, invisible beyond the rolling hills. "I gave up the badge because men started using it to steal land from poor families," Elias said. His voice was steady now. The tremor was gone. It was replaced by a hard, unyielding truth. He crouched down again. He looked Clara square in the eyes. He needed her to hear this, not just hear it. Understand it. "You see, Clara, a lot of folks think the law is just whatever the man with the biggest gun says it is," Elias told her. "But that's a lie. I gave up my badge to prove a point. A person's worth isn't measured by the acres they own, or the gold in their bank, or the clothes on their back." Clara listened. Her eyes never left his. "Every life is equal," Elias said, saying the words so clearly they cut through the Wyoming wind. "Your life, my life, the life of the poorest farmer grubbing in the dirt. We all have the exact same right to exist. And when a system loses respect for the basic rights of its people, when it uses the law to rob them instead of protect them, then that system deserves to be torn down. I wouldn't wear a star for a system that forgot what human dignity looked like." Clara absorbed the words. She nodded slowly. "Papa used to say something like that," she whispered. Elias picked up his hammer. He put his hat back on. "Your papa was a good man," Elias said. He held his hand out. Clara reached into her pouch. She placed a heavy iron staple right into his palm. "Let's fix the rest of this fence," Elias said. "Then we go inside and we see exactly what your papa left you." The kitchen table was wiped clean. The oil lamp in the center cast a warm yellow glow over the scarred oak wood. Elias laid the heavy canvas coat flat on the table. Clara stood across from him. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white. This was the only thing she had left of Joseph Holt. The smell of him, wood smoke, pine, and old leather, was still trapped in the heavy wool collar. Elias pulled a bone-handled hunting knife from his belt. "You sure about this?" Elias asked. He didn't want to cut her last piece of him. "Papa said not to let them take it," Clara said. Her voice was thin but steady. "He didn't say we couldn't look." Elias nodded. He took the point of the knife. He found the thick, clumsy twine stitching along the inside lining of the coat. He slipped the blade under the first loop. Snip. He worked carefully, moving down the seam, pulling the fabric apart. When he reached the bottom, Elias slid his hand inside the lining. His fingers brushed against something stiff, smooth. He grabbed it and pulled it out. It was an envelope, made of heavy oilskin tied shut with a leather thong. Elias set the knife down. He untied the leather. He opened the flap. He pulled out a stack of papers. They were folded tight, creased sharp. Elias unfolded the first one. He smoothed it flat on the table under the lamplight. It was a map, a surveyor's grid, stamped with the official seal of the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, dated 1869. Elias flipped to the next page. It was a list of names, 11 names, 11 families. Beside each name was a plot number and a signature. At the bottom of the list, clipped to the paper, was a transfer deed. It was signed by Harlan Briggs. It authorized the transfer of all 11 plots of land to the expanding Union Pacific Railroad. Elias felt the blood run cold in his veins. "My God," Elias breathed. He looked at the names: the Henderson family, the Miller brothers, the Tully farm. Agnes. "What is it?" Clara asked. She stretched her neck to see. "It's proof," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "Briggs didn't buy this land. He forged the foreclosure deeds, every single one of them. He stole the land from the people living on it, and he's selling it to the railroad for a fortune." Elias looked at the dates. The forged deeds were dated 6 months ago. The real surveys, the ones proving the farmers owned the land free and clear, were right here on the table. Joseph Holt had found them. He had stolen the real surveys back. He was going to Laramie, Elias realized aloud. Joseph was trying to get these to the federal judge. That's why Briggs had him killed. That's why they want you. Elias reached into the envelope one last time. There was one more piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter, written in pencil on cheap-lined paper. Elias unfolded it. "Elias," the letter began. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He read the messy handwriting. "If you are reading this, it means Clara found you. I taught her how to find your gate. I don't know if you're still there. I don't know if you're still the man you were. I found out what Briggs is doing. I have the papers. By the time you read this, I reckon I'll be dead. Briggs knows I have them. He won't let me leave the county. You don't owe me anything, Elias. That day in the mud at Beecher Island, any man would have pulled you out. I just ask you one thing. I don't have anywhere else to send her. I don't trust the law here. I don't trust the church. I only trust you. Don't let my little girl become a ghost. The world makes too many ghosts out of children. Keep her breathing, Elias. Take this to the federal judge. Joseph." Elias slowly lowered the paper. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. He looked at the papers. The weight of them felt heavier than iron. This wasn't just a squabble over a lost child anymore. This was the fate of an entire town. This was the lives of 11 families. This was a war. And he was just one man, a tired, broken man who couldn't even save his own wife and son from a burning house. Elias sank into the wooden chair. He put his head in his hands. "I can't do this," Elias whispered. The confession tore out of him. It wasn't for Clara, it was for the empty room. "Joseph, you fool. You sent her to a graveyard. I don't know how to protect her. Briggs has the sheriff. He has the bank. He has an army. If I try to fight this, they'll kill her, just like they killed—" He couldn't say their names. He felt a small hand on his arm. Elias looked up. Clara was standing right next to him. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She looked at the broken marshal with the steady, piercing gaze of a child who had seen the bottom of the world and refused to blink. "Elias," Clara said. Her voice rang out in the quiet kitchen. It was clear, unshakable. "Papa told me you would be scared," Clara said. "He said you had a reason to be." Elias stared at her. "But Papa also said that no one is born with the right to harm another person," Clara declared, speaking the words like a sacred vow. "He said that when bad things happen, the greatest courage a person can have is standing up to protect someone else, even if you don't share their blood, even if you are terrified." Clara pointed a small, scarred finger at the papers on the table. Those people out there, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Tully, they have a right to their homes. They have a right to be treated like human beings, not dirt for Mr. Briggs to walk on. Clara looked back into Elias's eyes. Compassion is the only thing that proves we are human, Elias. Papa died for that. He died so we could prove it. Elias stopped breathing for a second. He looked at the 9-year-old girl. He heard the echo of Joseph Holt in her words. He heard the echo of a truth he used to believe in before the fire burned it all away. Compassion is an action. Elias looked at his hands. They were scarred. They were tired. But they weren't dead. He stood up. The chair scraped loud against the floorboards. He reached out and placed his hand gently on Clara's head. "You're right," Elias said softly. The ghosts in the room didn't vanish, but they stepped back into the shadows. "Your papa was right." Elias gathered the papers. He folded them carefully. He slid them back into the oilskin envelope. He walked over to his heavy leather saddlebag hanging by the door and shoved the envelope deep inside. He turned back to the girl. The fire was back in his eyes. It wasn't a wildfire of grief anymore. It was a cold, controlled burn. "We don't run," Elias said. "Tomorrow, we go into Silver Creek. Tomorrow we start tearing Briggs's system down." Silver Creek wasn't a loud town. It didn't have the boom of the gold camps or the roar of the railhead cities. It was a town of dirt streets, false front buildings, and people who minded their own business. Lately they minded it a little too well. Elias rode down Main Street. The morning sun was bright, but the air was sharp. People walked the boardwalks. They swept their stoops. They carried flour sacks from the mercantile. But they didn't look at each other. They looked at the dirt. They looked at their boots. It was the quiet of a town holding its breath. Elias tied Rudy to the rail outside the livery stable. The smell of manure and old hay was heavy in the air. He walked into the dark, cool barn. A boy was pitching hay in the back stall, thin, scrawny. Looked about 16, but he had the hunched shoulders of an old man. Tommy Reeves. Elias stopped by the stall. He didn't say anything. He just let his shadow fall over the boy. Tommy stopped pitching. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, his hands were gripping the pitchfork a little too tight. "Mr. Cole," Tommy said. His voice cracked. "Tommy," Elias said. "I don't have nothing to say to you, Mr. Cole. I got work." "I didn't ask you a question yet." Tommy swallowed hard. He looked past Elias, out toward the bright street, toward the bank down the road. "You were working the day Joseph Holt brought his horse in," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Tommy looked down at the hay. "People fall off horses, Mr. Cole. It happens." "Joseph Holt rode with the cavalry," Elias said. His voice was quiet, flat. "He rode through mud and gunfire. He didn't fall off a gentle roan on a flat dirt road." Tommy's hands started to shake. "Please, Mr. Cole. Mr. Briggs owns this stable. He owns the roof over my head. I ain't got nowhere else." Elias looked at the boy. He saw the terror. He remembered what it was like to be scared and alone. He didn't push, not yet. "You keep breathing, Tommy," Elias said gently. "But you remember something. A man who makes you trade the truth for a roof isn't giving you shelter. He's putting you in a cage." Elias turned and walked out of the livery. He stepped back into the sunlight. He walked down the boardwalk, past the bank. He didn't look through the glass. He knew Briggs was in there, sitting behind his mahogany desk, counting stolen land. Elias kept walking until he reached the end of the street. The church was a simple white clapboard building. It had a modest steeple and a fresh coat of paint. Briggs paid for that paint. Everyone knew it. Elias pushed the heavy oak doors open. It was quiet inside. The air smelled of beeswax and old paper. The pews were empty. At the front, kneeling by the altar, was Reverend Daniel Shaw. Shaw was 50. He had graying hair and a soft waistline. He looked up when the doors closed. He saw Elias standing in the aisle. Shaw stood up. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked like a man who had just been caught stealing from the collection plate. "Elias," the Reverend said. He tried to smile. It failed. "It's been a long time since you walked through those doors. Are you seeking comfort?" "I'm seeking a man," Elias said. He walked down the center aisle. His boots echoed on the wood floor. "I'm hoping I find one." Shaw took a step back. "I don't understand." Elias stopped at the front pew. He looked at the cross on the wall. Then he looked at Shaw. "Joseph Holt is dead," Elias said. "Murdered, and you know it." Shaw paled. He looked around the empty church as if the walls were listening. "Elias, please. The sheriff said it was an accident. The judge signed off on it." "I don't care what a bought judge signs," Elias said. His voice started to rise. The rumble was building. "Joseph came to you before he died. He told you about the land surveys. He told you Briggs was stealing the farms." Shaw closed his eyes. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "I couldn't do anything," Shaw whispered. "Briggs is the mayor. He funds this church. He pays for the orphanage in Cheyenne. If I cross him, he ruins this congregation. I had to protect the church, Elias. Surely you understand that." Elias stared at the man. He felt a deep, cold anger settle in his chest. "Protect the church?" Elias repeated. He stepped closer. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The conviction in his voice filled the whole room. "Is your church made of wood, Daniel? Or is it made of people?" Elias demanded. Shaw opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "When you stay silent about a good man's murder, you are telling this entire town that a poor man's life is cheaper than a rich man's power," Elias said, pointing a finger at the preacher's chest. "You are standing at that pulpit and lying to them. The equality before God you preach every Sunday is a lie if you don't have the spine to demand justice for them right here on the dirt." Shaw trembled. "Elias, I'm just one man. What can I do?" "You can tell the truth," Elias said. "Because if you don't, every prayer you say in this building is just empty noise." Elias turned around. He walked back down the aisle. He didn't look back. He rode back to the farm in the late afternoon. The sky was turning bruised purple. When he walked into the house, the smell of roasted chicken hit him. Agnes was at the stove. Clara was sitting at the table. They were playing a game of cards. Agnes was losing. She was complaining about it loudly. Clara had a tiny, genuine smile on her face. Elias stopped in the doorway. He looked at the two of them. The anger from the town slowly drained out of him. He looked at Clara. She was safe. For now. He hung his hat on the peg. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table. "Did you find what you were looking for in town?" Agnes asked. She didn't look up from her cards. "I found out who folks are," Elias said. Clara looked at him. Her gray eyes were sharp. "Are they going to help?" Elias looked at the little girl. He thought of Tommy. He thought of Shaw. "I don't know yet," Elias said. "But we gave them a choice." Night fell hard on the Wyoming plains. It didn't just get dark. It got heavy. The wind died down around midnight. That was when the silence became a problem. When the wind blew, it covered the sound of footsteps. When it was still, every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Elias sat in the dark kitchen. The oil lamp was blown out. The only light came from the silver sliver of the moon through the window. He had his Winchester rifle resting across his knees. Out in the barn, Rudy snorted. It wasn't a sleepy sound, it was a warning, a low, sharp exhale through the nose. Elias stood up. He didn't make a sound. 7 years of farming hadn't ruined his step. He moved to the window. He peered through the glass, looking out over the moonlit yard. A shadow detached itself from the side of the barn. It was a man, tall, wearing a long duster. He didn't have a rifle drawn, but his hand rested comfortably on the butt of the revolver at his hip. Del Akers. Akers wasn't trying to sneak in. He wasn't trying to burn the house down. He was walking the perimeter, testing the fences, letting Elias know he was there. letting him know the 48 hours were ticking down. Elias eased the side door open. He stepped out onto the porch. He stayed in the deep shadow of the overhang. Akers stopped in the middle of the yard. He looked toward the porch. He couldn't see Elias, but he knew he was there. The instincts of a killer recognize the instincts of a lawman. "Cold night, Mr. Cole," Akers called out. His voice was smooth, casual. Elias didn't answer. He just levered a round into the chamber of the Winchester. Clack, clack. The mechanical sound cut through the cold air. It was a universal language. It meant, "Take one more step." Akers chuckled. A low, ugly sound. "Briggs says you've got something that belongs to him," Akers said. "A heavy coat. Maybe something inside it." "Briggs is mistaken," Elias said from the dark. "Maybe," Akers said. He took a slow step backward, fading back toward the tree line. "But men like Briggs don't like being mistaken. We'll be back, Mr. Cole. In the daylight, with badges. And you can't shoot a sheriff. Not even you." Akers turned and walked into the dark. A minute later, Elias heard the soft thud of hooves riding away. Elias lowered the rifle. He let out a long breath. Akers was right. They couldn't shoot the sheriff. If Elias killed Walt Garvey, even if Garvey was corrupt, Elias would hang, and Clara would go straight back to Briggs. Running wasn't an option either. Akers and his men would track them. They'd gun Elias down in the open plains and take the girl. He couldn't run. He couldn't shoot. Elias went back inside. He locked the heavy wooden door. He walked to the kitchen table. He struck a match and lit the oil lamp. He turned the wick down low, just a small yellow flame. He pulled out a piece of paper. He unscrewed the cap from an old bottle of ink. He picked up a pen. If he couldn't use a gun, he would use the one thing Briggs was terrified of: the light. Elias started to write. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to Agnes, telling her to stay away tomorrow, telling her to keep her doors locked. The second was to Sheriff Walt Garvey. He didn't ask for help. He told Garvey exactly what he had found in the coat. He told Garvey that if anything happened to Elias or the girl, copies of those surveys were already on their way to the federal judge in Laramie. It was a bluff, but Garvey was a coward. Cowards hated gambling. The third was to Reverend Shaw. It was only 1 sentence long. "Tomorrow we find out if your God is awake." Elias set the pen down. He rubbed his eyes. He felt old, older than his 44 years. He heard a soft creak on the floorboards. He turned his head. Clara was standing in the doorway to the hall. She was wearing the oversized flannel shirt. Her feet were bare. "You're awake," Elias said. "I heard the horse," Clara said. She walked into the kitchen. She looked at the rifle on the table. She looked at the letters. Was it the bad man? Yes. Did he leave? For tonight. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. She looked small in the dim light, but there was no panic in her, just a quiet, terrifying acceptance of how dangerous her world was. "Mr. Briggs has a lot of men," Clara said softly. "He has the sheriff. He has the bank. He has all the money." "He does," Elias agreed. Clara looked at the letters Elias had written. "Papa said that men with power always think they are right, because no one is brave enough to tell them they are wrong." She looked up at Elias. "Are adults with power always right, Elias?" Elias leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the oak table. He looked into the gray eyes of Joseph Holt's daughter. He needed to arm her, not with a knife, not with a gun, with the only armor that mattered. "No," Elias said. His voice was absolute, firm. "No one is right just because they have power, Clara. And no one is right just because they are older. Power doesn't make a man good, it just makes him loud." Clara listened, her eyes fixed on his. "A society is only good," Elias continued, speaking slowly so every word landed, "when people respect each other's rights. When the man with the gun refuses to step on the man without one. Briggs thinks he can buy the law. He thinks he can buy people. Elias reached across the table and placed his large, rough hand over Clara's small one. "Tomorrow morning we are going to walk into that town," Elias told her. "And we are going to take those rights back for the people he stole them from." "Will there be shooting?" Clara asked. She didn't shrink away. She just wanted to know. "I hope not," Elias said. He squeezed her hand. "We aren't going to fight him with bullets, Clara. We are going to fight him with the truth. Because when the sun comes up, the truth is the ultimate weapon of an honest man. It's the one thing Briggs can't buy." Clara nodded. She understood. "Go back to sleep, little bird," Elias said softly. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Clara stood up. She walked to the doorway, then she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "I'm glad your horse stopped, Elias," she said. Then she disappeared into the dark hallway. Elias sat alone at the table. He folded the letters. He slipped them into envelopes. He looked out the window. The sky in the east was just starting to turn the color of bruised iron. Morning was coming. Elias Cole stood up. He picked up his badge from the bottom of a drawer where it had sat for 7 years. He didn't pin it on his chest, he just put it in his pocket. He was ready. The morning sun hit the dust of Main Street, turning it into a golden haze. Elias Cole didn't ride in from the back trails. He didn't sneak through the alleys. He rode Rudy right down the center of the street. The town of Silver Creek stopped. Men outside the hardware store lowered their voices. Women pulling laundry off the line stood perfectly still. The blacksmith's hammer rested on the anvil. They all watched the man on the big brown horse. Elias wore his badge. He hadn't pinned it to his shirt. He held it in his left hand, the silver star catching the sun. In his right hand, he held the heavy oilskin envelope. He stopped in front of the Silver Creek Bank. He stepped down. He tied Rudy to the rail. He turned to look down the street. Sheriff Walt Garvey was standing outside his office. He wasn't moving. He just watched Elias. Elias didn't wait. He walked up the wooden steps. He pushed the heavy glass doors open. The bank was quiet, smelled of floor wax and old paper. The teller, an older man named Henderson, was counting coins behind the brass cage. 2 ranchers stood near the door, holding their hats. At the back of the room, behind a low oak railing, sat Harlan Briggs. Briggs wore a tailored gray suit. His desk was neat, not a paper out of place. He looked up when the doors swung shut. He saw Elias. He saw the envelope. Briggs didn't panic. Men like him rarely did. He just smiled. "Mr. Cole," Briggs said. His voice was smooth, rolling out over the quiet room. "I expected you to bring the girl to the sheriff's office, but the bank will do. Has she waited outside?" Elias walked across the marble floor. His boots sounded like drum beats. "She's safe," Elias said. He reached the oak railing. He didn't step through the little swinging gate. He tossed the heavy oilskin envelope onto Briggs's pristine desk. It landed with a heavy, final smack. "I'm not here about the girl," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. "I'm here about 11 farms." Briggs looked at the envelope. His smile tightened. "Just a fraction." "I don't know what you're talking about," Briggs said. Elias reached into the envelope. He pulled out the papers. He laid them out on the desk, right under the banker's nose. "These are the original land surveys," Elias said. "Dated 1869, stamped by the federal office in Cheyenne. And these are the transfer deeds you filed last month, the ones with forged signatures." The 2 ranchers near the door stopped breathing. Henderson, behind the brass cage, lowered a stack of silver dollars. The coins hit the counter with a loud clatter. "You're making a mistake, Cole," Briggs said. His voice dropped. It was cold now. "A very dangerous mistake." "Joseph Holt made a mistake," Elias corrected him. "He thought he could run. He thought you wouldn't kill him over paper, but you did." Briggs stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. He looked past Elias toward the back hallway of the bank. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A door opened. Del Akers stepped out. He didn't have his long duster on today. He wore a simple canvas shirt, leaving his gun belt clear and unobstructed. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver. "You're under arrest, Cole," Briggs declared loudly, making sure the ranchers by the door heard him. "For theft, for kidnapping, and for threatening a town official." Elias didn't look at Akers. He kept his eyes on Briggs. "You think you can buy the whole world, Harlan," Elias said. The front doors of the bank opened. Sheriff Garvey walked in. He looked sick. His face was pale, sweating in the morning heat. Behind him, looking terrified but walking anyway, was Reverend Daniel Shaw, and behind the preacher was Tommy Reeves, the stable boy. Briggs looked at the crowd. He frowned. "Walt, get this man out of my bank. He's raving." Garvey didn't move. He looked at the papers on the desk. He looked at Elias. "Walt," Briggs snapped, "do your job." "I intend to," a new voice said. It wasn't the sheriff. It came from the corner of the room. Elias turned. His heart nearly stopped. Clara was standing inside the bank. She had slipped in behind the preacher. She was wearing her oversized coat. Her face was pale, but her chin was up. "Clara," Elias breathed, "I told you to stay with Agnes." "Papa told me not to hide," Clara said simply. Akers saw his chance. The hired gun drew his weapon. He didn't aim it at Elias. He aimed it straight at the little girl in the oversized coat. "Everybody hold real still," Akers growled. He thumbed the hammer back. The click was the loudest sound in the world. "Cole, put your hands on the desk. You too, Sheriff. The girl comes with us." Elias froze. His hand was inches from his coat, but he couldn't beat a drawn gun. Not with Clara in the line of fire. Briggs smiled again. He reached out to scoop up the papers. "Stop." The word didn't come from Elias. It didn't come from the sheriff. It came from the brass cage. Old man Henderson walked out from behind the teller's counter. He was 62 years old. He had a bad knee. He had never fired a gun in anger in his life. He walked directly across the floor. He didn't look at Briggs. He didn't look at Elias. He walked right in front of Clara. Henderson put his frail body between the 9-year-old girl and the barrel of Del Akers' gun. Akers blinked. "Old man, move." "No," Henderson said. His voice shook. His hands trembled. But his feet were planted like old oak roots. Henderson looked at Akers. Then he looked at Briggs. Then he looked at the terrified men standing by the door. He raised his voice. He made sure every single person in the room heard him. "Put the gun down, Akers," Henderson said, his voice finding its strength. "We have been cowards long enough. We let Harlan Briggs trample on the dignity of this town because we were scared. But not today." Henderson pointed a shaking finger at the little girl behind him. "This child has a fundamental right to live," Henderson declared, the words ringing off the marble walls. "She has a right to be safe, and she has a right to speak the truth without a gun in her face. You shoot her, Akers, and you have to shoot me. And then you have to shoot the preacher and the sheriff." Henderson stood taller. "Because from this minute on, this little girl's life is the responsibility of this entire town. You want to strip her rights away? You have to go through all of us." The room went dead silent. Akers held the gun steady. But his eyes darted around. He saw Reverend Shaw step up beside Henderson. He saw Tommy Reeves step up on the other side. He saw the two ranchers by the door move away from the exit, blocking it with their bodies. And he saw Elias Cole, standing by the desk. A man with nothing left to lose, staring at him with eyes that promised hell. Akers wasn't a soldier. He was a hired killer. He did math. And the math in this room just turned completely against him. Akers slowly uncocked the hammer. He lowered the gun. He looked at Briggs. "I don't get paid enough to shoot the whole town, Harlan." Briggs's face turned the color of ash. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the people he thought he owned. They were looking back at him, and they weren't scared anymore. Sheriff Garvey finally moved. He walked up to the oak railing. He took his handcuffs off his belt. "Harlan Briggs," Garvey said. His voice was steady for the first time in 3 years. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and the murder of Joseph Holt." Briggs didn't say a word. He just held his wrists out. The metal clicked shut. Elias didn't watch Briggs get led away. He walked across the room. He knelt down on the marble floor. He looked at Old Man Henderson. "Thank you, John," Elias said softly. Henderson wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He offered a weak smile. "I'm just a bank teller, Elias, but I own my farm. And I own my soul. Figured it was time I acted like it." Elias turned to Clara. She was trembling now. The adrenaline was leaving her small body. He wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her close against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder. "It's over, little bird," Elias whispered into her hair. "It's over." Clara looked up. Her gray eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. "They came," Clara whispered. "What?" Clara looked at the men standing around them. Henderson, the preacher, the stable boy. "When I was at the gate," she said softly, "I screamed that nobody would come. But they did." Elias looked at the townspeople, then he looked back at the girl. "Yes, they did," Elias said, "because you were brave enough to bring the truth." The federal judge arrived from Laramie 3 days later. He wasn't a man you could buy. He was a hard man with a gavel that hit like a blacksmith's hammer. The trials were fast. The evidence was undeniable. Briggs was indicted on federal charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Nate Driscoll, the lawyer, folded immediately. He turned state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence. Del Akers didn't stick around to find out. He rode out of the territory the night of the arrest and was never seen in Wyoming again. The 11 forged deeds were torn up. The land was returned to the people who bled for it. The town of Silver Creek felt different. The heavy, suffocating silence was gone. People talked on the boardwalks. They looked each other in the eye. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Elias rode out to the graveyard. The cemetery was on a small hill overlooking the valley. The wind up here was always cold, always moving. Elias walked through the wrought iron gate. He held his hat in his hands. He walked past the old markers, past the faded wooden crosses. He stopped at a patch of freshly turned earth. There was a simple stone marker, Joseph Holt, 1831 to 1878, a good man. Elias stood at the foot of the grave. He looked down at the dirt. He didn't bring flowers. Men like Joseph Holt didn't care about flowers. They cared about things getting done. "I got them back, Joseph," Elias said. His voice was quiet, carried away by the wind. "The farms. The people are safe. Briggs is in chains." Elias swallowed hard. He looked at the name carved in the stone. "And Clara," Elias said. The name caught in his throat. "She's safe. She's smart. She's got a spine made of iron, just like you. I'm going to take care of her. I signed the papers yesterday. The judge made it legal. She's staying with me." Elias ran his thumb over the brim of his hat. "You pulled me out of the mud at Beecher Island," Elias whispered, "and you pulled me out of the dark here. We're even, my friend. Rest easy." Elias turned away. He walked across the hill, to the far corner, to the place he hadn't allowed himself to visit in 7 years. 2 small headstones sat side by side under the shade of an old gnarled oak tree. Ruth Ann Cole, 1833 to 1871. Thomas Cole, 1864 to 1871. Elias stopped a few feet away. His chest tightened. The old familiar panic, the smell of smoke, the heat of the fire, it rose up in his throat. His instinct was to turn around, to get back on his horse, to go back to the quiet farm and drink until he couldn't feel his hands. He stood his ground. He forced himself to walk closer. He knelt in the grass between the 2 stones. He reached out. His scarred fingers traced the letters of his wife's name, then his son's. The fire didn't come. Instead, he remembered the smell of Ruth Ann's hair, lavender and lye soap. He remembered the sound of Thomas laughing when Rudy nuzzled his pockets for carrots. He remembered the good things. Tears finally came. Not the violent, angry tears of a broken man. Slow, quiet tears. They rolled down his weathered cheeks and dropped into the dry Wyoming dirt. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back," Elias whispered to the stones. "I forgot how to carry you, but I remember now." He sat there until the sun began to dip behind the mountains. Then he stood up, put his hat back on, and rode home. That evening the farm was quiet, but it was a warm quiet. Elias sat on the front porch. He was oiling his saddle. Clara walked out the front door. She was wearing a new dress Agnes had made for her, blue cotton. It fit perfectly. She sat down on the top step, pulling her knees up to her chest. She looked out over the pasture. "Elias?" she said. "Yeah, little bird." "Does it ever stop hurting?" Clara asked. She didn't look at him. She looked at the horizon. "About Papa, about Thomas and your wife. Does the pain go away?" Elias stopped rubbing the oil into the leather. He looked at the back of her head. He thought about lying to her, telling her time healed everything, but she deserved better than cheap comforts. He set the saddle down. He walked over and sat on the step next to her. "No," Elias said honestly. "It doesn't go away, not really." Clara looked down at her hands. "But pain doesn't make us weak, Clara," Elias said. He made sure she was looking at him. He needed to give her this lesson. It was the most important thing he could teach her. Pain is a teacher. It teaches us to respect joy when we find it. Clara frowned. "I don't understand." "When you grow up, you're going to see a world full of injustice," Elias explained, his voice gentle but firm. "You're going to see men like Briggs trying to hurt people. You're going to see cruelty. And you're going to remember how much it hurt to lose your papa." Elias reached out and put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. "You must remember this," Elias said clearly. "True healing doesn't come from forgetting the past. It doesn't come from hiding in a farmhouse and ignoring the world. Healing comes from using your past, using that pain, to make sure no one else ever has to suffer the same way." Clara looked up at him. Her gray eyes were wide, listening. "Compassion is an action, Clara," Elias declared. "It's not just feeling sorry for someone. It's stepping in front of a gun, like Mr. Henderson did. It's riding into town when you're terrified. You honor the people you lost by protecting the people who are still here. That's how we survive. We carry the dead with us, and we use them to keep the living safe." Clara sat quietly for a long time. The crickets started to sing in the tall grass. The first stars poked through the darkening sky. "I think Papa would like that," Clara said softly. "I know he would," Elias said. "Elias?" "Yeah." "Can we plant corn tomorrow?" Clara asked. "In the north pasture. You said we needed to fix the soil." Elias smiled. A real deep smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Yeah, Clara," Elias said. "Tomorrow we plant." 3 years is a long time in Wyoming. It's enough time for a dry creek to cut a new path through the limestone. It's enough time for a burned-out patch of prairie to grow thick with sweetgrass. And it's enough time for a man to remember how to live. It was the autumn of 1881. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and turning leaves. The coal farm looked different. The western gate, the one with the rusted iron latch, wasn't rusted anymore. Elias had sanded it down. He had painted it white. Not because the wood needed it. He painted it white because Clara said it was a gate for important things. She said important things shouldn't look like they were falling apart. Elias didn't argue. He just bought the paint. Out in the north pasture, 40 head of cattle grazed, 15 more than Elias had 3 years ago. Some belonged to the farm. Some belonged to old man Henderson. The bank teller needed extra grazing land after a dry summer. Elias gave it to him for free. The front porch had 2 rocking chairs now, and the kitchen table was bigger. Elias had built a new one out of solid oak. The old one was too small for Friday nights. Agnes Tully came over every Friday night. She never waited for an invitation. She just showed up with a pie and a sharp tongue. Elias was in the barn. He was brushing down Rudy. The big brown gelding was 15 now. He was slowing down. His muzzle was turning gray. Elias didn't ride him hard anymore. He let the old horse take it easy. Rudy had earned it. The sound of quick hoofbeats approached the open barn doors. Clara rode in. She was 12 years old now. She was taller, stronger. Her face had lost the hollow, haunted look of a starved orphan. Her gray eyes were bright, clear. She wasn't riding behind Elias anymore. She was riding her own horse, a small, quick little mare named Penny. Clara slid out of the saddle. She didn't drop the reins. She didn't wait for Elias to do the work. She moved with practiced ease. She loosened the cinch. She pulled the heavy leather saddle off Penny's back and hoisted it onto a wooden rack. "Fences look good," Clara reported. She grabbed a brush and started working on the mare's coat. "Found a breakdown by the creek, fixed it. Wire was getting brittle, but it'll hold till spring." Elias kept brushing Rudy. "You didn't have to ride the whole perimeter today." "I wanted to," Clara said. She was like that. She didn't wait for chores to be assigned. She just saw what needed doing, and she did it. "Agnes should be here soon," Elias noted. He glanced at the sun slanting through the barn doors. "She threatened to bring a blackberry cobbler." "She said I look too skinny," Clara said, rolling her eyes. "She says it every week." "You're growing," Elias said. "Up, mostly. Go wash your hands. I'll finish up here." Clara gave Penny one last pat. She turned and walked toward the house. Her boots thudded against the dirt, confident, sure of where she belonged. Elias watched her go. He finished brushing Rudy. He gave the old horse a carrot, then he walked up to the house himself. When he stepped inside, the house smelled of roasted meat and coffee. But Elias didn't go to the kitchen. He stopped in the main room. He looked at the corner, the small wooden door, the storage room. For 7 years, it had been locked. A tomb for the things he couldn't bear to look at. 3 years ago, on the night Del Akers had prowled his yard, Elias thought about opening it. But he hadn't been ready. He was ready now. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small brass key. He walked to the door. He didn't hesitate. He didn't take a deep breath to brace himself. He just slid the key into the heavy brass padlock. It turned with a stiff click. Elias pulled the lock free. He swung the door open. The air inside smelled of dust, cedar wood, and old paper. He stepped into the small room. It was cramped, stacks of boxes, a heavy leather trunk sitting on the floor. He knelt down in front of the trunk. He unlatched it and opened the lid. There were folded dresses inside, cotton and wool, still smelling faintly of lavender. Beneath the dresses were books, dozens of them, leather-bound and dog-eared. Elias ran his hands over the covers. He didn't feel the heat of the fire. He didn't hear the screams. The ghosts were gone. In their place, there was just a quiet, profound love. A love that didn't hurt to hold anymore. He pulled out a thick volume. An atlas of the world, full of colored maps and drawings of faraway places. Ruth Ann had used it to teach her students in Dodge City. He took the book. He closed the trunk. He walked back out into the main room. Clara was coming out of the washroom, drying her hands on a towel. Elias held the book out to her. Clara stopped. She looked at the heavy leather cover. She looked at the open storage door. She knew exactly what that room was. "What's this?" Clara asked. Her voice was soft. "It belonged to my wife," Elias said. His voice was steady. It didn't crack. "She was a teacher. She believed that if you knew how big the world was, you wouldn't be so afraid of the small piece of it you lived on. I think she'd want you to have it." Clara took the book slowly. She ran her fingers over the embossed gold letters on the cover. She looked up at Elias. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Elias smiled. "Besides, I'm taking you to Laramie next month to file some papers at the land office. Figure you should know what the map looks like before we get there." Clara's eyes went wide. "Laramie? Truly?" "Truly," Elias nodded. The sound of wagon wheels crunched out in the yard. "That'll be Agnes," Elias said, "and the cobbler." The evening passed the way all their Friday evenings passed, loudly, with laughter. Agnes complained about the town council. Elias drank his coffee and watched them argue over a game of cards. Clara won, as usual. She had a memory like a steel trap. Later, after Agnes had driven her wagon back down the dark road, Elias and Clara sat on the front porch. The night was clear. A million stars hung over the Wyoming plains. Clara had the heavy atlas resting on her lap. She wasn't reading it in the dark, she just liked the weight of it. "Elias," she said. "Yeah." "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she asked, "if Rudy hadn't stopped at the gate?" Elias leaned back in his rocking chair. The wood creaked. He looked out at the white gate glowing faintly in the starlight. "No," Elias said. "I do," Clara said softly. "Sometimes. I think I would have kept running, until I couldn't run anymore. I think I would have disappeared." She turned her head. She looked at the man who had taken her in. "Thank you," Clara said, "for not staying on the horse, for not riding away." Elias looked at the 12-year-old girl. He saw the strength in her. He saw Joseph Holt. And he saw something entirely new. Something that belonged only to her. "You did the saving, Clara," Elias said. "You brought the truth to my door. I just opened it." Time didn't stop in 1881. It kept rolling forward the way time does. Elias Cole never put the silver star back on his chest. He didn't need to. He stayed in Silver Creek. He planted his corn. He fixed his fences. He drank coffee on the porch. He became a man the town looked to when things got hard. Not because he had a gun, but because he always told the truth. He carried Ruth Ann and Thomas with him every single day, not as a heavyweight dragging him down. He carried them like a compass, pointing him toward the light. Clara May Holt grew up. She grew up tall, she grew up smart, and she grew up with a fire inside her that the Wyoming winters couldn't touch. When she turned 18, she didn't leave Silver Creek. She stayed. She stood up in the new schoolhouse, a building funded by the honest men of the town, not the corrupt ones. She stood at the front of the classroom, holding Ruth Ann's old books. She became a teacher, but she was more than that. When the railroad companies tried to push the ranchers on freight prices, Clara organized the ranchers. When a new mayor tried to pass a law taxing the poorest farmers out of their homes, Clara stood up in the town hall. She didn't yell, she just spoke the truth, loud and clear, until the men in suits backed down. She became a force of nature. One afternoon, a young reporter from a newspaper in Cheyenne came to Silver Creek. He was writing a story about the changing West, about the people holding the line against the big syndicates. He sat across from Clara in the schoolhouse. He looked at the confident, steady 18-year-old woman. "Miss Holt," the reporter asked, adjusting his spectacles, "people say you're the backbone of this valley. They say you stand up to men twice your age and 10 times your wealth. Tell me, how did you become a woman who fears nothing?" Clara sat quietly for a moment. She looked out the window of the schoolhouse. Far out past the edge of town, she could see the rolling hills. She could see the white gate of the Cole farm. She turned back to the reporter. Her gray eyes were completely serious. She didn't smile. She wanted him to write down every single word exactly as she said it. "I am not a woman who fears nothing," Clara stated, her voice ringing clear in the empty classroom. "I still feel fear. I feel it every time I stand up to a powerful man." The reporter quickly scribbled in his notebook. "But I learned a lesson from a very good man when I was 9 years old," Clara continued, making sure the young man was looking at her. "He taught me that no one has the right to abandon their fellow human beings when they cry for help. Fear is natural, but letting fear make you a coward is a choice." She leaned forward across the desk. "The right to live, the right to speak, the right to be treated as an equal human being, these aren't things that are just handed down by the rich and powerful," Clara declared, speaking the absolute truth she had learned in the dirt and the blood of her childhood. "They are things we must constantly fight to protect for each other. You don't walk away when someone is being crushed by the system. I don't stop fighting. Because years ago someone refused to let my scream of "nobody will come" become the truth. We are the ones who have to come for each other. That is the only way a civilized world survives. The reporter stopped writing. He stared at her, profoundly moved. "Who taught you that, Miss Holt?" he asked quietly. Clara smiled. A small, warm smile. She looked out the window again. "A horse," she said, "and a man who refused to ride away." He had spent 7 years learning how to disappear. It turned out all he needed was one reason to stay. She weighed 58 pounds and had her father's eyes. And she had been walking toward his fence for 3 days. Some journeys end at a gate. Some gates are the beginning. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales, is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Out here in the wide, unforgiving silence of the West, people like to believe that survival belongs to the strongest hand, the fastest draw, or the man with the most power. But this story tells us something deeper, something quieter, and far more enduring. Strength is not found in domination. It is found in restraint. In choosing to stand still when fear tells you to run. In choosing to protect when the world teaches you to look away. Elias Cole was not a hero because he carried a gun. He was a hero because, after losing everything, he still chose to care. That is the hardest kind of courage there is. When life has broken you once, it is easy to close your door, to protect your peace, to convince yourself that staying out of trouble is the same as doing what is right. But the truth is, indifference is often the quiet ally of injustice. And the moment we decide that someone else's suffering is not our concern, we begin to lose something essential in ourselves. Clara, small and wounded as she was, carried a truth that many grown men had forgotten. That dignity does not come from wealth, status, or power. It is something every human being is born with. And when that dignity is threatened, it is not just the victim who is tested, but everyone who witnesses it. Her courage was not loud. It was not fearless. It was simply the refusal to stop believing that someone would come. And in the end, that belief changed not just one man, but an entire town. There is also a powerful lesson in how pain shapes us. Elias tried to bury his past, to lock it away like that room he refused to open. But pain does not disappear when ignored. It waits. It lingers. And yet, this story shows us that pain can become something else entirely. It can become a compass, a reminder of what truly matters. When we choose to use our past not as a shield, but as a reason to stand up for others, we transform suffering into purpose. And perhaps the most important truth this story leaves us with is this: compassion is not a feeling. It is an action. It is stepping forward when it would be easier to stay back. It is speaking when silence feels safer. It is standing beside someone who has no one else, even when the cost is high. Because in the end, a community is not built by laws or institutions. It is built by people who refuse to let each other fall. So when you walk away from this story, remember this: every day, in ways big or small, we are given the same choice Elias faced at that gate: to keep riding or to stop, to turn away or to stand. And while we may not always feel ready or strong or certain, the world does not change because of perfect people. It changes because of those who choose in a single moment to do what is right. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life, to change a town, to change the course of a story, is the simple decision not to ride away.